the Africana Studies and Research Center. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all. I would like to begin by thanking our co-sponsor, the Institute for German Cultural Studies. Also thank the Institute for Comparative Modernities, who has given us this splendid space for our intimate talk. And I'd like to begin by saying that I'm of two minds. It's not good to be of two minds making a public presentation. The first part of what I want to say is that it's a pleasure and honor to welcome, to present Professor Grant Farrell, whose intellect I admire for its depth, its breadth, and especially on top of that for its daring. Not many people can pull it off, but I think that he does. He is the author of several books, Midfielder's Moment, Colored Literature and Culture in Contemporary South Africa. It came out with Westview in 1999. What's My Name? Black Vernacular Intellectuals, Minnesota 2003. Long Distance Love, A Passion for Football, Temple 2008. Phantom Call, Race and Globalization and the NBA, 2006. In Motion, At Rest, The Event of the Athletic Body, which came out of Minnesota in 2014. And now a pamphlet, Martin Heidegger Saved My Life, Minnesota 2015. Besides these, he's also edited collections on C.L.R. James and Modumbe. He's been the editor of South Atlantic Quarterly for 8 years, I think it was. 8 years, that's right. And he's with us today to present his pamphlet. Now, the other part of me is, I still haven't forgiven him for spilling that drink on me when we met. Flight to Barbados, Caribbean Studies Association meeting. Didn't know the person, spilled the drink on me. The first thing Grant Farrell ever said to me was sorry, and it's been downhill ever since. All kidding aside, it's an honor and pleasure to welcome my colleague Grant Farrell.
Before I thank you for coming, I want to say that I did say I'm sorry. I got on my knees, and it was a splendid pair of silver sneakers, and I cleaned them with my napkin. So I was a proper colonial, in the most colonial of the British West Indies. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate you folks taking your time this afternoon. I'm sure you have other things to do, but I appreciate you being here. I want to thank all the folks in Africana and German, Institute of German Cultural Studies, particularly towards Paul Fleming, who put their resources into this, and without any compunction in Paul's nature, it always makes things possible. I'm grateful to him on at least 3 or 4 occasions, and so once more, thank you very much to Gerard, who had to more or less convince me to do this, because I can say quite happily I don't want to be reading this here. And I'm going to offend everybody, but I'm very good at that. But I want to thank Professor Ashing for doing this and making it possible, and all the folks in the Africana Studies Center, the assistants, Ms. Mulligan, Mr. Veen, Mr. Porter, who was here this afternoon. Thank you very much for doing this, and the poster, Mr. Porter, and for Alexis Boyce from ICM, Professor Hassan for giving us the space. So thank you very much. I'm going to read for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes max, and then I'll take some questions. So, again, thank you for coming. I'm going to start with the governing rubric for this pamphlet by Heidegger. We do not know what thinking is, but we do know when we are not thinking. That's Heidegger from Was heißt Denken. And then a quote from Gilles Deleuze's book, Foucault. Statements inhabit a general realm of rarity within which they are distributed begrudgingly, even inadequately. No sense of possibility or potentiality exists in the realm of statements. Everything in them is real, and all reality is manifestly present. All that counts is what has been formulated at a given moment, including any blanks, and gaps. It is nonetheless certain that statements can be opposed to one another and placed in hierarchical order. That's the Deleuze. This is me. Guy Fawkes Day 2013 was crisp, a bite in the air, like autumn days are supposed to be. As someone who grew up in South Africa, a former British colony, Guy Fawkes Day has a special significance. Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November, has historically been celebrated with displays of fireworks. The day commemorates the British state's successful felling of the gunpowder plot in 1605, an attempt by English Catholics to assassinate King James I and replace him with a Catholic monarch. One of the plotters, Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes as he is sometimes known, was caught beneath the House of Lords with the explosives he was going to use to blow up the house. I was on sabbatical for the fall semester of 2013, but I had a meeting with my research assistant, who is here, thank you Ms. Bragg, on Guy Fawkes Day morning to finalize the indexing of the book that was then forthcoming. I came home after meeting at my office, changed into work clothes, sturdy, water-resistant boots, warm sweatpants, a sweatshirt, topped by a puff pullover and a wool hat. We lived, my wife Jane, my son Ezra, who was just 5 years old then, and I, in the village as do many folks, on Cayuga Heights. Our house is long and sprawling and is populated by a large number of trees. Oak and hickory mainly, which shed like crazy in the autumn, and the hickory sheds nuts which attract deer. I like raking leaves. On the other hand, I have little affection for the deer who hurdle our 4.5-foot fence with impunity. Raking leaves is repetitive, almost mechanical labor, but it edifies the soul, or so I tell myself. Good thing I like raking, because it's a never-ending job in the autumn. As soon as you rake the leaves into piles and put them by the side of the road, so that the village of Cayuga Heights Department of Public Works can collect them, there's more and more. I enact the role of a small-time Sisyphus, accept the boulders and endless pile of leaves that I rake up the hill, almost literally again and again. Sometimes I take the easy option and rake them down the hill. I'd been raking for about 40 minutes on Guy Fawkes Day when a late model Volvo sedan, white, stopped on the top of the hill, where our house ends, and then reversed about 20 meters to where I was raking. Inside were two distinctly middle-class white people in their late 70s. The man in the passenger seat was wearing a tweed jacket. The woman was clad in what looked like a fairly high-end sweater, fine wool, cashmere maybe, if I know my fabrics. She beckoned me over. This act of hers, it was no small thing. Or this act of hers, small to her, was anything but a routine gesture to me. This act of hers, it immediately put me on my guard. I'm a diasporized black South African. I was raised under the strictures of apartheid. The 1976 student rebellion known as Soweto erupted when I was just 6 months into high school. Growing up under apartheid left its mark on me. In truth, it would have been impossible for it not to. I have, as a matter of political necessity, apartheid demanded it, if one was to negotiate the unequal terms of South African society within its success. So I have developed a sense for what an encounter which begins with a white woman hailing a black person might entail. In an encounter such as this, Deleuze's notion of a statement, everything is real, and all reality is manifestly present. Being summoned in this way by a white person, this was real. Being hailed in this way was a real statement of political intent by the white woman. I could understand the statement only as loaded for me with political intent. This encounter, taking place in liberal Ithaca, New York, was hauntingly familiar to me. Of course, Ithaca 2013 is not Soweto 1976, but being so hailed, this was for me deep in my bones, nothing other, nothing less than an apartheid-made reality. Everything I knew, even that which I thought I might have forgotten or repressed, came flooding back, with a deliberate force that took me no time at all to recognize. In the instant of my being hailed, apartheid was once again immediately manifestly present. You see, just for a moment, all that counts is what has been formulated at a given moment, Deleuze. What has been formulated for me in Cayuga Heights had been given at a certain moment, formulated for me under far more oppressive conditions. These different formulations, however concatenated, spoke to each other, and in so doing spoke to me, reminding me of what counts in the act of being beckoned, a black person being beckoned by a white one. All the statements about racial encounters, white people and me, involved some form of exchange. I had formulated in a different context. I had to grudgingly, inadequately retrieve. I was once again subject to those formulations. Unsurprisingly, I had little, if any, difficulty finding access to those statements, and then many evocations once again. Every formulation demands its own response, and so I had to find in being summoned my own statement of intent. What was clear to me in the moment of being hailed was that I could not rely on the simple act of substitution. I could not make one statement stand in for another. None of those moments in which I had rejected the particular violence of American racial inequity, and there were moments enough over the course of 25 years I've been living in the United States, would suffice now. A new statement, I knew, was necessary. Substitution was not possible because, as Deleuze says in his meditation on Michel Foucault as the new archivist, statements can be opposed to one another and placed in hierarchical order. It is crucial to recognize from the very first the opposition between the statements. On the one hand, there is my statement, that of a diasporic black man, and on the other hand, there is the white woman's, which I take to be a purposive statement. The work at hand was to find not only the statement itself, the statement of the moment, the statement for the moment, the statement that I needed. It was also necessary to find the proper hierarchical order of the various statements that I have over a lifetime archived. Statements that emerge out of those various political encounters where I've had to state myself, to those whom I am close, to those to whom I come in contact with as teacher, colleague, friend. My position to state myself. In order to produce the statement, that I had to decide how things are arranged, in which order they stand, and to do so is always, as we know, a political act. As I was being hailed by this white woman in Ithaca, there was, however, also resonating from South Africa another voice. This voice, possessed of a singular authority, there is nothing else that commands us quite like it, reminded me, these are elderly people, be polite. This was my mother's voice, calling to me as if I were, just for a moment, back on the segregated streets of Cape Town. I was being called back. It was as if I had never left apartheid South Africa behind. Indeed, that may be possible. From across the Atlantic, making nothing of the intervening decades since my departure to American shores, or the 8,000 miles that separate Ithaca from Cape Town, my mother's injunction was clear. These people are older than you. For my mother, who belongs to the first generation of South Africans raised under apartheid, but remains possessed of a British colonial sensibility, age orders how we are in the world. Age occupies an elevated place in my mother's social hierarchy, and it comes complete with its own set of demands. Propriety does not quite do it justice, but it may convey at least something of the sentiment that informs my mother's figurative but audible intervention. Deference to one's elders. It's how they raise us in the colonies, or in the settler colonies. That would probably be a more accurate historical description of disenfranchised life in the apartheid state. This is my mother's political inheritance, one she bequeathed to her children and her grandchildren. It is because of my history of disenfranchisement that I knew, that I could tell, that I knew it in my bones, as they say, what the rhetorical shape, the nature, and if truth be told, I could sense what the content of this encounter between the elderly white woman and the laboring black man would be. It was of no consequence that the black man was laboring in his solitude on his own property. I had no doubt that I knew what was about to take place. Simultaneously, of course, it was impossible to know. And yet, because I had no doubt, I was prepared. But I did not know that I was prepared and what I was prepared for. Nor did I know what the effect of my preparation would be. Nevertheless, before my preparation came to bear on the encounter, I had to acknowledge that there were differences. In racially segregated South Africa, this white woman would have infantilized me in the most offensive, but by her standards, routine way. She would have, in the dominant parlance of apartheid, have addressed me and any other adult black male as boy. In apartheid South Africa, I would have been expected to accept such an address and to answer in its terms. I would have been expected to ask with forced humility. It never got easier, even with regular practice. Yes, madam, or in Afrikaans, depending on the nature of the exchange and the rhetorical shape of the encounter with the white speaker. As a disenfranchised South African, I would have been expected to know the transcript. Subservience. The logic of propriety among the disenfranchised derived from the political reality that there was nothing the disenfranchised adult could do in the face of white South African infantilization but answer to boy or girl. Such humiliation was a fact of apartheid life. It was a burden born with resentment. Sometimes this resentment was masked as civility, sometimes it was a burden born with clenched teeth, sometimes the resentment could not hide a clenched fist. The village of Cayuga Heights is, like most faculty enclaves, ghetto within the pejorative, in the U.S. predominantly white. As you know, for its sins, Cayuga Heights is sometimes, not unfairly, without a certain irony, named Cayuga Heights, whites by the locals. In my Cayuga Heights, with a white woman, I was spared the diminutive. In America, they do things differently. However, in her summoning me, this white woman returned me to that apartheid reality of hierarchies, naming, and of course, the grammar of infantilization. This white woman seemed to do so without any effort on her part. But to be fair to her, how could she have known of my recourse to the discourse of apartheid? After all, her question arose out of a different, but not entirely distinct, political. I was returned to the apartheid state because above all else, discernible in her command, and it was an imperative, one to which I acceded for complicated reasons, as we have just seen, is what Jacques Derrida names the order of the voice. The voice erupts, her voice erupted rudely into the solitariness of my labor. It jolted me out of my contemplations and my physical enjoyment. The power of the voice is that it impels us, sometimes whether we want to or not, to listen. The voice draws us to it. The voice draws us into worlds that are not ours, calls out to us, giving us, as Martin Heidegger says, food for thought. The voice becomes the stuff of our thinking because the voice makes us think about what it is that calls us. The voice makes a political difficulty of how it is that we are called, how a voice here or there, from today or long ago, calls out to us. How the voice calls to us, calls other voices, other sounds, other resonances, other inflections to us. Every voice has the potential to animate every other voice. It seems possible that a single voice, the smallest calling out, can make every other voice audible to us, present to us. The voice in Cayuga Heights, already wanting me by virtue of just hailing me, addressed a question to me. Would you like another job? The woman asked me. There was no common noun at the end of the question, but it was clearly audible. I knew it as I had anticipated I would know it. I was being named boy. I was being treated as a boy. This woman had clearly discerned from a cursory glance, not that I liked raking leaves for poetic purposes, but that I would undertake this task, raking leaves, only for remuneration. As such, and for her this would have inevitably followed, I was, inadvertently or not, advertising my availability as cheap labor, as cheap waste labor. For the white bourgeoisie, it seems not to matter very much where they find themselves. Would you like another job is a simple enough inquiry. It means nothing, it is routine. This is the way of the white bourgeoisie. Ask the black labor directly, with a minimum of rhetorical courtesy. The racialized laborer deserves not a word more than is grammatically necessary. It is not necessary to offer a formal or even a casual greeting. There is no need to bother with, "Excuse me, sir." No, not even a cursory "hi" is required. Get directly to the point when inquiring from the black man if he wants more work. For the white woman, the logic is seamless. I have leaves that need to be raked. I see a black man at work raking leaves. I ask the black man if he wants to rake my leaves. The black man now has potentially 2 jobs raking white people's leaves. As Marx cautioned us about bourgeois illusions, they may be illusions, but they are necessary illusions. They are illusions necessary for the production of the bourgeoisie, and those illusions have an effect in the world that the bourgeoisie rarely seems to consider. Growing up under apartheid then, bearing within myself the legacy of apartheid, proved to be, in the Cayuga Heights encounter, beneficial in a historically salient way. Apartheid had prepared me well, better than I could ever have imagined, for my Guy Fawkes Day exchange. Well, not exactly like Guy Fawkes Day 2013, but something like it, in general. And to be prepared in general is to be prepared for everything. The effect of that preparation is not only that it lasts a lifetime, that it stays with you longer than you could ever imagine. The effect of that preparation is, although I could not have known this in 1976, that it is imminently translatable. The term apartheid may or may not be translatable, but its effects as a form of political pedagogy, in this instance, turned out to be invaluable. As a consequence of the political education imposed on me, I did not miss a rhetorical beat. When the white woman asked, "Do you want another job?" I responded without a moment's hesitation, "Only if you can match my Cornell faculty salary." That was all I said, and having made my statement, I turned on my heel, rather smartly, if I might say so. My first thought, that which came immediately after the statement I made to the white woman, was an entirely unlikely one. It struck with the ringing clarity of this thought. This thought presented itself to me almost pristine and unembellished amidst all the tumult in my head. I could hear myself utter this thought that came after the statement, even though I did not move my lips. On the other hand, I could not name everything else that was jostling in my head. But it might have been rage and anger, right there alongside outrage and indignation. Most likely it was accompanied by a vivid flashback, live and in living color, as they say, of apartheid, and a profound sense of being psychically assaulted. All of these feelings swirling together, this feeling, rage, say, indistinct from that, indignation. Somewhere in there, too, was a hint of mirth, just the slightest sense of amusement that I had said this thing to this white woman. Together, these things produced in me a keener understanding than I could ever have imagined possible of Heidegger's notion of the relationship between thinking and speaking. Heidegger says, only when man speaks does he think, not the other way round. I had spoken how I had spoken. I had spoken as I had not known I would or could speak. In that speaking, Du Bois is right in this regard. I quote, "They whose lot is gravest must have the carefulest training to think aright." End of quote. For my own sake, I had to think. I had to think aright. In order to think, I had to be taught to think when I considered myself, everything about me, my apartheid past, to be at stake. Through my speaking, through the ordering of the voice, I had accomplished in that moment, thinking. This accomplishment goes to the core of my thought that followed immediately my speaking. Let me state it. Thank God for Martin Heidegger. This was quickly followed by, thank God for Was heißt denken. There was barely a breath in between my response and my giving thanks. I spoke in the direction of Martin Heidegger because Martin Heidegger had saved my life. Not Heidegger, of course, not only Heidegger, of course, but also apartheid, how the ironies compound, and my mother, whose resonating historic voice, issued a caution. Mainly, however, it was for Heidegger. It was Heidegger I thanked. For years now, I've been reading Martin Heidegger again and again, teaching him, writing about Heidegger, using Heidegger to take up other questions, other authors, seemingly unable to get too far away from Heidegger. And always with Heidegger, always with Heidegger scholar Thomas Sheehan's caution in my mind about my capacity to think Heidegger. And I quote, "When it comes to Heidegger, there are no experts, only varying degrees of ignorance." Sheehan is just a boiler analogy that people say about Hegel. Struggling with Heidegger is what one does with Heidegger, so as to decrease the degree of ignorance. About that there can be no question. However, Sheehan confesses his ignorance, although there are few scholars of Heidegger who know more about Heidegger, invites critique in order, and I quote, "to show a clearer way beyond Heidegger." End of quote. For my part, in that moment, I understood one thing above all else, that I owe my response to Martin Heidegger. My debt to Heidegger is the debt of the ignorant reader of Heidegger. My debt to Heidegger as a thinker who, in my engagement with him, always insists upon the thinking of thinking. For that moment, I did not seek a way beyond. It was enough to be thinking. In his biography of Heidegger, Between Good and Evil, Rudiger Safransky argues that Heidegger, and I quote, criticizes any philosophy that professes to have its beginning in thought, end of quote. For Heidegger, according to Safransky, philosophy begins, and I quote, with a mood, with astonishment, fear, worry, curiosity, jubilation, end of quote. In Between Good and Evil, Safransky makes a good case for how to approach Heidegger's philosophy. However, what I take from Heidegger seems to contradict Safransky because my engagement with Heidegger always begins in thought. This may very well be my shortcoming, or it may be that every time I turn to Heidegger, there it is, definitively in Was heißt Denken, constitutively present in the Principle of Reason, or in his essay, The Principle of Identity. Heidegger on thinking, Heidegger teaching himself and us to think. It is because of this that apartheid might have prepared me for my encounter with the white woman, but what was clear to me was that it was Heidegger who had saved me, and this is why Heidegger saved me. Martin Heidegger poses for me again and again the question of thinking. We do not know what thinking is. Because of Was heißt Denken. True, I had the grammar of apartheid to hand, but the logic of apartheid was an object lesson in what not to say. Follow the script. Biopolitically valuable in itself, of course, but not quite what was needed in the moment in Cayuga Heights. Martin Heidegger saved me because it is him who made me think about what to say before I was called upon to say it. I would not have been without Heidegger bereft of a response, but it would not have been in any sense worthy of the work on thinking that Heidegger has done. It would not have been the work of thinking. That is the critical distinction that I must acknowledge. There is a crucial difference between the response produced by thinking and the response devoid of it, what Heidegger identifies as polemic. And I quote, any kind of polemic fails from the outset to assume the attitude of thinking, end of quote. In order to assume the attitude of thinking, the polemic must be eschewed because it amounts to nothing but the failure of thinking. Thinking becomes, in the Cayuga Heights encounter, a response par excellence to the unthought question of the white woman. Would you like another job? Is the question that is without thinking. It lacks thinking because in this situation, the white woman need only adhere to the terms of the dominant racial discourse. Hers is a rote inquiry. It bears no relation to thinking. The only proper political response to the question that is presented without thinking, the question that is rooted in an objectionable politics, is to speak thinking. The Cayuga Heights encounter is grounded in an a priori dialectic. Without properly knowing it, it is impossible to know it in advance, however prepared one is. My fidelity to thinking Heidegger allowed for my response and my rejection of not thinking as located not in the woman's question, but in the unimaginable possibility of my not thinking about what needed to be said. The latter is clearly a prospect I dread. If I did not offer the statement that I did, it would have meant that I had not learned to think. We must learn thinking. And in that encounter, nothing could have been for me more politically irresponsible than not thinking. The unthinking response to the unthought question can only be described as a failure of Heideggerian proportions. This is how Martin Heidegger saved me. Firstly, he made me think about thinking, about learning to think, of living with his repeated challenge. And I quote, most thought-provoking for our thought-provoking age is that we are still not thinking. Well, end of quote. And secondly, he translated the question about what I would have said to the white woman if I had not been thinking in the terms of Was heißt Denken into a matter for thinking. This act of translation is the only guarantee I have, a guarantee which is itself not guaranteed, of course, that I am thinking about thinking. I was thinking about what I did not say, so that my thinking about what was left out, omitted, not said, but reflected upon repeatedly afterwards was, in the most productive sense, the result of my being haunted by an absence. The negative force of thinking, one is almost tempted to name it, because on the one hand, it did not matter what I did not say. On the other, that is precisely what must be subjected to thinking. The consequence of the thoughtful questioning addressed to the absence that is not an absence, but the presence of a haunting. Why did I not say what I did not say? Why did I not say what I could have said and would in narrow political terms have been fully justified in saying? I could have sworn. I did not. This leads to the question why Heidegger, to which we will return, in a form expanded to address other proper names, names whose non-useful trouble might turn to Heidegger, which is of course encapsulated in the title of this presentation, Martin Heidegger Saved My Life. This questioning, which might be more or less thoughtful, will lead us back in the most provocative way to the question, why not Heidegger, which is itself a negative declaration, or a declarative negation, a clear commitment to thinking about thinking of the first question. Something of that ambivalence, of the tug and pull between questions, as it were, was present in that single moment when the only sentence I could construct was, thank God for Martin Heidegger, and that was the thought that dominated my being. I know that it is strange, but I did not, until I undertook to write this essay, ask, how could I have produced in that moment, as an answer to the white woman's question, the response that I did? How did my speaking come to bear my thinking? How did it come to bear thinking in just this form and not any other? Attribution was not an issue in the moment when I stated my thoughts as I did, which is clearly a problem. It is explicable that attribution was not the first or second or order of business in the wake of my response, since preoccupation with the encounter is what took precedence, but it is still a problem, hence the turn to thinking, why attribution is not a problem, after thinking, my response indebted to Heidegger. Attribution is always now, as it surely was then in the moment of articulation, itself a matter of no consequence. You see, from the time I was growing up as a boy in Cape Town, I must have been practicing turning words over in my head, rearranging the order of the words in anticipation of just such an encounter. The words that seemed to have come out had been spoken exactly as they should have. I could not have known that it would come to me where it did, in Ithaca, New York, but I must have been constructing that sentence in my head for all of my life. It came to me, that sentence, fully formed, full of thought, formed in and by thought. However, I did not construct that sentence by myself, so attribution is at the heart of everything. This we can easily glean from the intensity of the attribution. Thank God for Martin Heidegger, a colloquial, everyday phrase made to do extraordinary work, extraordinary philosophical work, Safransky might say, in and because of the encounter. There is, as is always true, something adversarial in my difficulty about attribution. To acknowledge Martin Heidegger is clearly a struggle for me, and yet it is not. In choosing this thinker rather than that thinker or other thinkers, is to know firsthand that there is something of substance at stake in that choice, in the figure to whom we attribute our thinking. Excuse me. This is the final third, maybe 40%, section that I'm going to read. It's called the only thing essential to thinking is thinking. This statement is so important that it can only be phrased declaratively, even stridently. The only thing that is essential to thinking is thinking. The thing about thinking is that it excludes nothing, and in so doing, it exposes itself to everything. In this way, thinking is undisciplined. It runs the risk of including within itself everything, a risk constitutive of thinking, and in taking this risk, it exposes itself to everything. In doing so, thinking insulates itself against nothing. Therefore, as Heidegger says, we must always seek out thinking and its burden of thought in the element of its multiple meanings. Everything else will remain closed to us. And Heidegger's burden of thought begins from the premise that thinking dedicates itself to searching for the element of its multiple meanings, that it will not admit of the possibility that anything remains closed to thinking. There must be no prophylaxis against thinking. Nothing must remain closed to us. Of course, this is not to suggest that thinking is without discrimination. Rather, as we will see shortly, thinking never hesitates when it's necessary to adjudicate, to make judgments, or to order itself. But that, however, is what happens after or in the ever-ongoing work of thinking everything. There is no end to thinking. There is nothing we can imagine as post-thinking. However, the work of judgment, when it comes in the present, or the present of thinking, can be undertaken only after thinking as much as possible. As we well know from Bashai's Denken's turn to Nietzsche, Plato, among others, thinking as much as possible is no small task. And since it is always necessary to be thinking in order to lay claim to thinking, after thinking is best understood as belonging to the aporia. It marks an interruption, a slowing down, a meditation on thinking, if you will, before thinking is taken up fully again. Thinking apprehends itself. It is only possible to think in anticipation of the apprehending that lies on the immediate horizon. And so, I apprehended my own thinking. What is most provocative in our thought-provoking age is that we are still not thinking. Because what did not come to me in the encounter is what apprehends me now. I did not until, or maybe sometime after, that is before now, but after the encounter, reference or turn to any one of a number of figures who might have been presumed more obvious or appropriate resources for my response. I did not turn to Malcolm X's famous hypothetical that is, it would seem, more or less tailor-made rhetorically for my encounter with the white woman. After all, the question Malcolm X is supposed to have asked offers itself as a paradigmatic resource for my encounter. The question attributed to Malcolm X is, remember what you call a nigger with a PhD? His answer, of course, is famous both for its succinctness, a single word already iterated provocatively in the question, and for its democratic structuring of American racism. The perverse democratizing of the black experience in the US, his answer rendered formally, which is to say with a capital N, as we know, is nigger. Malcolm X's answer, which is anti-academic and possibly anti-intellectual too, strange given that this is a man who came to his epiphanies precisely through and because of one of the monotheistic books, is intended to disabuse educated African Americans, and probably all black people too, of the illusion that formal education could insulate them against racism, routine and structural. The structure of racism for blacks in the US cannot be effectively countered by acquiring a PhD. Neither can it, in Malcolm X's terms, be challenged by acquiring devilish knowledge. All black subjects are equally vulnerable in the face of racism. My encounter in Cayuga Heights attests to that. Neither my PhD nor my professorial appointment could, in the encounter, shield me from the two white residents of my neighborhood. Indeed, what do they call a nigger with a PhD? Boy. That is what I heard echoing softly. Boy concatenated to nigger, echoing a little less softly. Apartheid South Africa and upstate New York yoked into a relation of, as, racist poetics, boy and nigger, silent, resonant, reverberating. What did the white couple hear in my voice? Did they detect my foreign accent in those 8 clipped words? Did they recognize thinking as that which was articulated in and through my response? How could they know that Martin Heidegger was no more foreign to me than the nationalist politics of Malcolm X or the novels of Toni Morrison? How could I not have heard the first line of Morrison's most acclaimed work, Beloved? 124 was spiteful. Now some days, but certainly on and since Guy Fawkes Day 2013, our house, 540 Cayuga Heights Road, strikes me not so much as spiteful as haunted as 124 Bluestone Road was certainly haunted by that unspeakable violence, hauntings that Sether, Baby Suggs, and Paul D know so well. Hauntings of a different order, I hasten to add, and yet the thing of it is, every haunting recalls every other haunting. I did not know when Jane, Ezra, and I moved to Cayuga Heights that we'd be living so close to Morrison's house on Bluestone Road. Following Morrison's lead and the newly unearthed presence of Beloved in my haunted neighborhood, it seems proper to historicize Cayuga Heights as the originating scene. This requires a statement that is a negation. 540 Cayuga Heights Road was not the original scene of misapprehension. Neither was my raking the source of the white woman's misapprehension. My identification and other is not attributable to my raking. To borrow that memorable indictment of Vichy France for disenfranchising the Jews of Algeria from Derrida's monolingualism, and I quote, "The withdrawal of French citizenship from the Jews of Algeria, with everything that followed, was the deed of the French alone. They decided that all by themselves, in their heads. They must have been dreaming about it all along. They implemented it all by themselves." End of quote. They, which the white woman stands as, must have had a figure of the black man in their heads, in their bourgeois illusions, long before they addressed their question to me. That question was a lifetime in the making. The black man was approached as other because the black man was in their heads all along as a black man other. The other was other long before the white self approached me, raking my leaves on my property. I was other. I was approached only because I was other. Any one of my white colleagues who lived within shouting distance of 540 Cayuga Heights Road could have been dressed in exactly the same attire, and they would not, under any circumstances, have been subjected to this inquiry. The other can be approached as other because the other's mode of being in the world is distinct from the white self's. Whatever protestations my white colleagues might offer, they know, regardless of how they dress, that my mode of being is distinct from theirs. The other, we can assert, is always susceptible, vulnerable to the possibility of the spiteful encounter. Nothing can insulate the other from the white Volvo and the wantings that are loosed when it stops and approaches the black man. It is necessary now, I recognize, to insist on this couple's shared culpability. The male passenger said nothing even though he was closest to me. That is, the white man did not speak against the white woman's question. He acted as if her question were entirely ordinary, so he did what he has, I presume, always done. He went along with it. They came to the inquiry together, side by side, literally. Nor did the white man acknowledge my response, or if he did, I did not, in turning my back on them sharply, hear him rebuke or disagree with her. My exchange then was never only with the white woman. It was rather a triangulated encounter, one in which silence, the white woman's response to my question, was compounded by another. Theirs was the silence of complicity, silence joining together in the face of the other's rejoinder. How many silences were disordered? 1, 2, none? The correct answer, however unknowable it might be, must begin in the knowledge that there was at least one silence. The answer then is at least one, but more likely 1 plus. The unarguable one, however, is mine. That is because the question of silence does not end with the colluding white couple, but extends to me. I was silent in relation to the canonical black figures. I did not draw upon them as a resource, not in the first instance, as I have already stated. I did not draw upon Malcolm X, and that is no small matter. I remember pondering that, but only afterwards. I only turned to Malcolm X thinking about why I did not turn to him. When I turned my back on the couple, I went back to raking. However, I was no longer simply gathering the leaves into a pile. I was by no means fully tuned into the edification of my soul, but neither was I agitated. I was already overtaken by thinking, or, as is equally likely, extending myself into Heidegger's conundrum on thinking. Or I was had accepted what Heidegger calls the gift of thinking. I quote, "Thinking is thinking only when it pursues whatever speaks for a subject," end of quote. I had accepted Heidegger's gift because he provoked me to think about what had spoken for me as a subject. I had pursued Heidegger, called to him, not to any other. A felicitous act, an act which provoked me to ask why thinking led me where it did. Heidegger, not Malcolm X, had spoken for me. Heidegger, not Frantz Fanon, whose critiques of colonialism find resonance in my work in other moments. My response did not recall that famous scenes in Black Skin's White Mask when in Paris or Lyon, the young Martinican student is apprehended by a little white girl with a phrase that bristles with uncomprehending recognition. "Look, a Negro." In Cayuga Heights, it might have been rendered by the driver and the passenger in that Volvo as, "Look, a black man will work for us." To be black is to live, as a matter of course, with the possibility. It is in truth a perpetual threat of misapprehension. It is to live with the prospect of being named, of being subsumed into a racial, racist, or racist economic category. But again, Fanon's and mine interpellations of a different order, but they animate each other, these addresses to the other, no matter their difference. Heidegger, not W.E.B. Du Bois, whose oft-quoted opening line of The Dawn of Freedom, the second chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, that is, as we know, the problem of the 20th century, is the problem of the color line, retains more than a century later its declarative force. As a critique of American racism, it is difficult to imagine a more Bracean line. I did not draw on Du Bois, a figure whose work is central to the founding project of Cornell University's Africana Studies. Martin Heidegger, not Toni Morrison, was spinning around and around in my head. Heidegger and Heidegger alone, splendid in his solitude, occupied me, speaking for me, allowing me to speak in such a way that was faithful to thinking, We do not know how thinking will organize itself. Thinking is true only to itself. On second thoughts, maybe I was entirely out of sorts and utterly unable to shape the effects of the encounter just passed. The encounter that was passing through me as an encounter of such an order that it made me think about thinking as I had never thought about thinking before. Heidegger, and I quote, "We come to know what it means to think when we ourselves are thinking. If our attempt is to be successful, we must be ready to learn thinking." End of quote. Maybe in that moment after the encounter, that could not be disarticulated from the encounter. Disarticulated from the encounter itself. I needed to turn to thinking, to learn thinking more urgently than I ever had before in my life. We do not know what thinking is, but we do know when we are not thinking. Without Martin Heidegger, I am convinced, as is surely patently clear by now, it would have been impossible for me to have produced a response that disables the white couple. Martin Heidegger saved my life. My response was entirely the product of thinking. My answering Heidegger's call manifests itself most visibly in my refusal to accede, to submit to an entirely different rhetorical repertoire. Malcolm X's, Fanon's, Morrison's, Toni Morrison's, Du Bois's. This quite rightly provokes the question, why? Every question is in itself an epistemological problem, because no one knows where any question might lead. We do not know what the question that begins with a white woman will open up. Even in the silence, however, we can assert with Derrida, and I quote, that the voice is heard, understood, end of quote. In the disorder of the voice, we are free to assert the voice is understood with an unrelenting clarity. In the silence, the voice is heard because every timbre echoes loudly in the silence. We hear so much better because of the silence. It is possible in the silence to hear Heidegger's call to intellectual responsibility, a call that resonates profoundly with a deeply personal and psychological aspect. In this context, where the fidelity to one thinker over others presents itself with such a wrenching and yet not difficulty. I quote from Heidegger again, "One thing is necessary, though, for a face-to-face converse with the thinkers, clarity about the manner in which we encounter them. Basically, there are only two possibilities. Either go to their encounter or go counter to them." End of quote. Here, there is no escaping it because Heidegger demands an explanation. In the face-to-face encounter with the thinkers, it is absolutely necessary to account for why one goes one way and not another. Heidegger demands, as he brings us face-to-face with the thinkers, that every one of us declare ourselves. Heidegger's is a call for specificity, for clarity, for ruthless calculation. He asks of me, why is it that Martin Heidegger made the response possible and no one else? To be made to think in this way is to account, to know expressly what is at stake about race, philosophy, thinking itself, and the question, why Martin Heidegger? This question, there can be no denying, is the source of a great deal of perturbation. It reveals the turbulence that is unleashed by my turn to Heidegger. The first line of the interrogation is an obvious, but by no means unjustified one. Why does the black man respond? His precise turn of phrase come from Heidegger. Heidegger, after all, is a figure whose actions are the source of considerable consternation among philosophers. Beginner and ending for some, with his support for the project of National Socialism. The debate that was revived for a new round of exploration, condemnation, and the call to dismiss Heidegger's work most recently in 2013 with the publication of the Black Notebooks. Heidegger, the Nazi. How is it possible that a Nazi can make the black man think? After all, to state the obvious, Nazism concerned blacks, as it did Jews, homosexuals, Romani, and scores of others, Untermenschen. How can it be that Martin Heidegger is the source of my salvation? That is only the first level of critique. The second, and this leads to a series of concatenated questions, is negatively praised but full of invective and replete with indictment. Why not, in the moment of the encounter, invoke Morrison, Du Bois? Does the turning to Heidegger stand as an implicit accusation? Malcolm X and Fanon do not think. If thinking orders itself through our thinking, and the turn to Heidegger cannot stand as anything but a Heideggerian declarative. I went in the moment of record with the encounter. I went counter to them. I went counter to Du Bois, Malcolm X, Morrison, Fanon, and that was, there is no getting around it, a profoundly philosophical choice, and as always, philosophy has implications for politics. No one exemplifies this better than Heidegger. However, in order to answer the question why Heidegger, it is necessary to understand the precise terms of the choice. To proclaim my choice in him, An indictment or even a judgment of any other thinker would be to undermine the philosophical specificity of my preference for the encounter. While there might, of course, be nothing simple about this issue, it is still possible to offer a simple statement. It's a matter of philosophical recognition, and there can be no gainsaying the importance of that. I turned to Martin Heidegger, or Martin Heidegger came to me, or Martin Heidegger made his thinking available to me for one reason above all others. Of all the philosophers I have turned to, of all the thinkers I am familiar with, of all the theorists I read, Martin Heidegger is the only one who explicitly sets himself the task of thinking about thinking. Heidegger could not, as we have seen, be clearer about this than he is in Was heißt denken. It is the task of thinking that he sets us. It is up to us in this regard to match Heidegger in his dedication to thinking. We can only match Heidegger if we can match his efforts to think about why thinking is all we should think about. In this regard, maybe we should posit Guy Fawkes' Day only secondly as an incendiary event, as an explosion into the anti-democratic politics of 17th century Britain. Maybe we should approach Guy Fawkes' Day as the occasion for an insight that is routine in its philosophical expectation, routine by Heidegger standards anyway, but explosive in its effects. Guy Fawkes' Day comes to us as a kind of political and philosophical epiphany when you least expect it. One moment you're raking leaves, the next you're thanking Martin Heidegger. The truth is, we should always be prepared to hear things explode. On Guy Fawkes' Day, however, we should be more prepared than usual to hear the explosion set off by thinking. At the core of the encounter in Cayuga Heights is the recognition that a critical part of thinking is to listen, to hear ourselves thinking. So, I'll finish, yeah. I'm just going to read, I'll read the last part and then I'll spare you this. I'll just say this. We do not know how we will come to thinking, nor can we determine before the encounter itself, in it or long afterward, which philosopher will bring us to thinking. Neither is it possible to account for how the various forms, thinkers, contexts, their relation to each other, of what I'm naming here, is all contaminated thinkers, apartheid South Africa, Heidegger, will interact, how they will inform, shape, inflame, distort, or enable each other. That is itself a matter for thinking. Most importantly, however, is the recognition that contamination is a motive for thinking, not an impediment to it. More important even is the recognition that you never know which thinker is going to save your life. Many thanks.
Questions, right? Yes. Question. Oh, comments.
Thanks very much, Grant.
Thanks very much.
My question is perhaps a side issue, but it was one that intrigued me greatly when I read your little book that you attribute to Heidegger making accessible to you a rhetorical, I think, entirely different rhetorical repertoire from that of Malcolm X, or Malcolm X, Fanon, Morrison, or Du Bois would have made available. And you distinguish between what you call a response produced by thinking, Heidegger, and a response that has been produced by polemic. But it seems to me, I'm curious about, for me, the distinctive feature of the response, which you like, and we're pleased that you had given that response and you turned smartly on your heels, is a certain rhetorical structure, a kind of faux naif structure that you, as if you pretending as if you might be interested in this job, if you would rate these for them if they would match your Cornell.
And I would.
Whereas you could have said almost without thinking, do you want another job? No, I'm a Cornell professor. I take that would be a polemical response, would it? So there's a difference between that, just saying, no, I'm a Cornell professor, I don't want another job, and your more carefully crafted response. And since Heidegger is not known as someone who likes to theorize rhetoric, who tends to be sort of dismissive of poetizing and things like that, he's interested in language that reveals being. I'm just curious about the role of Heidegger in getting you to this crafted response, the special rhetorical response that I agree you probably would not have found in Fanon. But maybe Toni Morrison is a pretty clever rhetorician. She might have made certain rhetorical tools.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I also think Heidegger is disingenuous because he is profoundly interested in how he writes. That's why the repeated turn to Hölderlin, and that's what informs Denken, you know, the principle of reason. Those are all profound engagements with, you know, with Hölderlin and with poetry, and I think there's some stuff on Robbie Burns even in Principle of Reason. And I think Heidegger is trying to write his way to another language. I think after you know, the events of the late 40s, and you know, he's been told to leave the university, he is trying to find another language. And I think that language, despite what he says, because Heidegger says, remember, like you can only do philosophy in two languages, German, or secondly German, firstly Greek. So even on that score I failed Heidegger. I couldn't produce a German or a Greek response. And I apologize to Martin. But I think there's something to your question. I mean, I take Heidegger's poetry, when he says like the stuff about a bridge, you know, like he has in a Bauern, Wohnen, Denken essay, you know, it's the bridge in which we find, in which we locate. I mean, there's a difference in that language, I think. From that, it distinguishes that language from what happens in Simon Zeitler. And those are very different languages, and so I think I don't take Heidegger seriously when he says, you know, like I want to reveal being, I want to make this possible, I want to write this. I think there is a profound poetry to Heidegger's writing.
You know Heidegger much more than I do. I'm wondering then, what if Heidegger says, and I think I'm understanding you correctly, that speech reveals thinking, and as Professor Culler pointed out, Heidegger is very much concerned with how language reveals being. I'm wondering if that speech is equivalent to language, or if it's a kind of subsection of language. So I guess I'm wondering to what are the limits, I guess, of speech insofar as it reveals thinking. Does like writing count as a kind of speech? Does bodily movement count as a kind of speech that also reveals thinking?
Yeah, that question goes to the heart of something Heidegger says. Because as long as we expect language to just continue in this old-fashioned, outmoded way, we won't get, and this he says in the Bauern, Wohnen, Denken essay as well, we won't get anywhere close to what language can do. So when he says, you know, like speaking, we come to thinking through speaking, or we come to speaking through thinking, it seems to me that what he's trying to suggest there is not that these things have to be counterposed, but that in order to think, we have to command language in a very specific and disciplined way. And perhaps this is piggybacking on your question in order to answer that one. It's the precision of my response that I am taken by. Only if you can match. It begins on a conditional clause. Only if you can. There's nothing declarative in that, which leaves open all kinds of rhetorical possibilities. And the main rhetorical possibility it mobilizes is disarming the white woman. Only if. Because in that way I declare myself as a member of the professoriate. I reveal the racism of her question, the unthinkingness of her inquiry. I don't have to say any of those things. But if I begin in the conditional, only if you can match my Cornell faculty salary. The key word there is faculty. Because if I just said Cornell salary, I could work in the maintenance plant. But it is to mark myself through opening on the conditional, only if. In other words, yeah, I'm willing to rake leaves. Pay me a professorial salary, right? That way you mobilize speech through absolute discipline. Economy, precision, and knowing which form of address is necessary. And that's what I think when Heidegger says, you know, we still haven't understood fully how to properly mobilize language. That's what I take that in my response to have responded to, or to have taken from Heidegger, is that how you command language begins in your willingness to think language, and that precision can only emerge from thinking, nothing else. right? So you can, all the questions you ask are vital, but what matters much more than anything is that you continue to think that discomfiture, so that in the moment of record, when you are called upon to account, you can mobilize precisely the right rhetorical phrasing. That's what matters. Can you be a rhetorician in that moment? Can you command language as it needs to be commanded, like it has never been commanded before? Sorry, I sound like an old-fashioned revivalist. Yeah, I am, sort of, like stumping for the Church of Martin.
You have a tendency to do that in class going.
I'll remember that, Mr. Gray. There'll be a letter of recommendation along the line. And behavior such as this will be noted. Remember, I command language. He used to be a good guy. It's all right, Professor Fletcher. Yeah, were you in?
Yeah,
You look poised.
I mean, if I'm allowed to answer your provocation with potentially another provocation. And actually it's somewhat serious. I mean, what I worry about here, as much as I love the provocation, what I worry about is a certain fetishization of thinking. And a certain potential emptiness of thinking. And just using one common example that you don't really mention, which is Marx at the beginning of German ideology, where he talks about the young Hegelians and their emphasis on phrases. And if you just have the right phrases, then if we only get the phrases in order, that's all we need. He says, and I'm not going to say, he says these are actually the most reactionary. This is the most, it's not about phrases. So if you could distinguish a little bit, or counter this kind of potential, what I could see as a fetishization of a somewhat clearly abstract and almost empty notion of thinking. Yeah. And a repetition of thinking, without even a notion of concept or anything. And if you could articulate a bit more, then could perhaps put that in dialogue with the Marxist view of how to articulate this encounter.
Yeah, I like that counter. It seems to me one's effective, and perhaps Marx's own instance of sloganeering. Right? It's like, this is the emptiness. This is what you say about it. And like when you mark people as reactionary, you've already, as it were, done injury to thinking.
Yeah.
That would be my first visceral response, but the other one would be that I come to Heidegger after a certain mode of political engagement, apartheid South Africa, all those kinds of things, and a kind of almost an exhaustion with thinking, with sloganeering and action, as the fetishization of action. As long as you act, things are going to be okay. We know that, and we will know this in 2 years, especially, not to be true, right? Because we're all lining up for the event of 2017. It's been 100 years. Yeah. What have we achieved? And what has that thinking produced? So Heidegger says something that, this is why I am smitten with this Heidegger's notion, because he says it's not that we think too much and act too little, but that we think too little and act too much. Let me see if I can fill that in for you. Heidegger's call to thinking is a call to a profound kind of action. As long as we do not think, we are capable of racism. As long as we do not think, we are capable of all kinds of heinous acts, discriminations, injustices. I think that's where Heidegger takes me. That thinking is a kind of act about how one is in the world. In other words, if you think about how you are in the world, how one dwells, as it were, dwelling is being is thinking, unless we can think about the world as we should, we will always encounter these acts that are unthinking. So one has to act with thinking, not as, again, a guarantee that this is how things are going to turn out, but thinking as the first act of politics. Not thinking without action, but thinking as an action that can lead to a just outcome. The kind of outcome I think Marx would have validated, but I am uncomfortable with dismissing Heidegger, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but one can hear that. I do not understand myself to be fetishizing this at all. I understand myself to be taking seriously in the injunction that the only way to act in the world is through thinking. The thinking is the first and most necessary act before we can make the world what it is we want it to be.
Thanks a lot. It was beautifully written and kept you kind of captivated, but it was hard for me as soon as I realized what the plot was, because we live in Cayuga Heights, and my husband was out working in the yard, and someone stopped and said, "Do you want another job?" Now, and I say that, knowing exactly the same words, and my husband came into with his tail between his legs, saying, "Someone asked me about this working in the yard." So, I mean, because people don't work in the yard and they own their houses in Cayuga Heights, but but
it's news to me.
But okay, so I'm just telling you that was our experience. On the other hand, of course, we have a white Volvo in the driveway. It was not us. Okay, but so,
Shakespeare, ladies protesting too much, that kind of thing.
so this, I mean, this is only to say that I had to come into the talk with that lived experience. That's the one. The other one, of course, is a slight prejudice against Heidegger because I'm an Adornoite, but I'm not that much of an Adornoite. Here I would really want to be, and this would tie it together for me, right, a Fanonian. Because what resonates with the Marxism, or the Marxist approach, is the necessity of this being mutually constituting. And, where he talks about the violence of the, it's just not just victim and perpetrator, it's the mutual victimization through the relation of violence that produces the other in its interaction. Now, I say that because I think that allows Fanon to get to race in a way that Heidegger doesn't allow you to, although you did in your existential experience, because that was your existence. Whereas my husband, with the same words, didn't go there. So I'm saying that there's something in Heidegger for me that is too lacking in a dialectic, too lacking in the mutuality, because we don't know this woman in the car. We don't know. We can presume that you're right, that she made it as a racist comment, and that my husband was just looking like a Slav, and so it was done for a different reason. But we don't know. We don't know from your story. We don't know, right? We do know what your reaction had to be given your past and what it means to you. But what I object to in Heidegger, even if he may be poetic or rhetorical, is there's a kind of stopping at the existential, which doesn't allow for that return philosophically. And maybe I'm not making too much sense, but it seems to me to make sense in the case of Cayuga Heights.
Okay, I am deeply unsettled by that, and I'll tell you why. Deeply. Your husband's experience is the exception, and you're right. It's an exception for the white man to be treated in that way. It's routine for the black man to be treated in that way. And I say somewhere else in the book, the pamphlet rather, that I could easily, my experience is not, and this is where I'm going to
No, okay, because I know that's true, but I don't know how Heidegger gets you to get there. Okay.
Let me see if I can work us there.
Okay.
Let me see. Now I'm going to undo what I said. My routineness and his exceptionality is tied up in the following way. Because I could easily be transported into Austin, Texas, or Palo Alto, California, where I'm a brown man, mowing my lawn. And the same question can be posed. So your husband's experience and mine, and the faculty member from the University of Texas at Austin, and the Stanford professor, we could all undergo the same experience. Except we cannot. Because your husband is the rare moment, and you point this out, for the white man to be approached in that way. And in some ways it heartens me. Because it makes me think they just treat all people who labor in their solitude badly.
I have nothing against the way you interpret the experience. I'm saying that there is a kind of blank, and I would put it in Heideggerian. I've found always with Heidegger this kind of blank for the other side, because it turns, it seems to me in Heidegger, into a kind of ontological situation where the relationality of any speech is somehow, you know, it can't be approached, and that in no way takes away from the really beautiful explication of the existential experience for you. But Fanon gives us, or even Toni Morrison it seems, gives us a way to not have to fall back on simply one person's experience, be it my husband's or yours.
Again, what I'm saying is mine is an entirely unexceptional experience. And I'm saying 99 times out of 100, the white woman's question is the right question. Because a laboring black man is available cheap labor. So I am at once the unexceptional figure of labor and the Heideggerian figure. That may be.
If they're not the same, Heidegger doesn't allow you to say the first, does he? Or do I miss something in Heidegger?
I think
Mine is not a critique of you, it's a critique of
and you see,
Heidegger.
that's what, and I don't want to defend Heidegger, I only want to thank him. And you know,
Okay.
that's something very different, because I'm saying, had it not been for Heidegger, I've read Fanon, and I have a limit with Fanon, and this is my limit. It's always the declarative. It's always the declarative with Fanon. It's a little like reading Zizek, you know, except Zizek has a kind of 13-year-old boy's facility with a joke.
They're not the same.
But, you know, like it's that, let me tell you that this is, and I have an impatience with that. And with Heidegger, there isn't. There is an almost platonic occupation with this one thing. How do I think? Again and again, it's what he asks us. It's what I find most engaging about his work. And so I never find myself excluded by Heidegger. I find myself drawn in and made uncomfortable by my being drawn in. So there's, for me, the question, why is it that he produces this language in me? Why am I drawn to this thinker? What is it this thinker makes me do that no one else can? And I am not saying Fanon isn't useful, because he is, and clearly there's a reason why he's, you know, ubiquitous, particularly in places like South Africa now, where Pico won't do, we have to go to the original, it's, you know, let's go back to Fanon. But Fanon is not the writer that Heidegger is, and he doesn't think about thinking itself. That's the task Heidegger sets us again and again. In some ways, another answer to your question, and that is an act of labor. That is work, and that makes both my exceptionality and my ubiquity difficulties. Difficulties to be thought, difficulties to be thought again. So that I cannot say I am this, you know, like, oh, this is a great response, because I can just stand with that response. It isn't, it's what makes that response possible. How does that response come to be, and why does that response continue to haunt me in my having produced it? So, unlike this possibility that Heidegger shuts things off, Heidegger's, you know, call to thinking, in fact, becomes a refusal of the impasse, and a deep commitment to going on with that project, to thinking again about what you might call the dedication, because this is nothing less than a dedication. Martin Heidegger saved my life. One cannot expose oneself more, I don't know, more than that, right? To acknowledge, I thank, who the hell thanks Martin Heidegger? A very sick man, apparently. A very sick black man. Much worse than that. A black man who grew up under apartheid thanks Martin Heidegger. Are you freaking crazy, kid? I mean, like, it could be me, not the kid, of course, but do you understand? It's Heidegger's refusal to let me stop at this point. It says you have to think about why it is you think, and then what it is you don't think. So the Heideggerian project is by its nature incompletable, and therefore a continual call to politics. Sorry, I mean, I can hear Fanon, but I am tired of this, like, you know, the humanism, or the new humanism, the new man, and yeah, those things, they can mobilize me, but thinking is the thing.
The dialectical part.
And that's where I'm Jamesonian. I think Fred's right when he says in this moment, we have to get rid of the dialectic. The dialectic is too easy because it lets us counterpose things, and then we think something else is going to come out. Here with Heidegger, there's one road, baby. It's called thinking, and you had better follow that all the way. Whatever the twists, the turns, the turn to poetry, Holderlin, and so on, all these terrible things that are happening here, the Schwarzer Hefte, all those things, you will have to think them. There's no way off this world. You're on, and you're on for the rest of your life. Professor Dalford.
Thanks for the talk. I have a little comment about the one sentence and a question about another sentence. So the sentence of your response, fully formed, it's interesting to think of in terms of the history of the philosophy of language. In 20th century, broadly speaking, I think we tend to think that there's no thought without language. But in the 18th century, there are a bunch of cool people like Diderot and Condillac who are interested in a kind of sentence that emerges instantaneously, even though they were very attentive to syntax and things getting spread out in time and space. They both thought there was a kind of sentence that Condillac uses the word tableau. Diderot uses the figure of hieroglyph. There's this odd kind of instantaneous sense, which was very cool. Then one of my other questions you may have already answered is the sense of your title and why it's Martin Heidegger Saved My Life, not, and this would sell a lot fewer books, The Protocols of Thinking and Martin Heidegger's Philosophy Saved My Life. Like, why is it?
Good luck with that.
We so often use the proper name as a synecdoche for the thought, but it seems like there's way more at stake for you.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
the sentence occurred to you, Martin Heidegger saved my life, or thank God for Martin Heidegger. And you talked about needing to thank Heidegger, not just, oh, I'm indebted to his texts. So could you talk a bit about just that formulation?
I think that's perhaps getting at the same kind of difficulty that you're trying to make me account, but I'm clearly failing miserably, but not for want of effort or pretense of thinking. I'm taken firstly by that notion that the sentence could have come from somewhere else. And maybe that's all I'm trying to write toward. Like figuring out how do I come. It's not just that I think great sentence, I guess. But here's the odd thing. So this happens around 2 o'clock on the 5th of November 2013. I don't tell my wife about this. My wife was white until 8 o'clock. And I say nothing about that sentence. So for the next 6 hours, the stuff is just in my head. And that's not a pretty place to be at the best of times. But on this day, it's there, and I can't. How do you say this to somebody? Because it's not like it's an unusual experience for me. Like I'm a black person. I've been accused of shoplifting, or like I know when I'm walking around in a department store. I like clothes. You buy them, you know how you're being watched, right? I mean, these things are all routine. So I don't understand at one level how I come to produce the sentence. It's not just that I think great sentence, so I'm very proud of myself. But I don't understand it. I spend the next 15 months essentially trying to understand that. And so you have, thank God for Martin Heidegger saved my life. And that's not just the press. I wanted that because in that moment it felt, and to speak to your question, it felt like existentially nothing had been on the line like it was on the line in that moment. It wasn't that this hadn't happened before, but there was something that was on the line that had previously not been challenged. I'd never felt so vulnerable, but neither had I ever felt as in command as I do in that moment. And it comes from that ability, as you say, to produce the fully formed sentence, to be able to command language, but also, most importantly for me, to command my own thinking. And this is why I know I thank Heidegger, because our former colleague Molly Haidt used to say, we don't choose books. Books choose us. There's something strange and fortuitous about that, but I know that I'd spent maybe the last 9 years before that in anticipation of that moment. And what I mean by that is I had started reading Heidegger, started teaching him, started thinking about him, and just, going, being in time I love, but it's was heißt denken. And so the preoccupation with, this is the truth, what is the work of the intellectual, which probably answers your question as well. The work of the intellectual, I am now convinced as I have never been, is to think. And so the sentence, I understand, comes from Heidegger. because he had not allowed me to ever be released from that responsibility. Once you open the door to was Heidenken, you have to think about yourself and how it is you think. And so I can understand when you say the quarrel was not with Heidegger or the sentence comes fully formed, but to have to live with a ghost of a dead man who is disparaged and has committed awful things, and then to understand how that man allows you to do your work, to be an intellectual. Thank God for Martin Heidegger, which is followed by Martin Heidegger saved my life. And that's not hubris. It could very well be considered as such. It's not hyperbole. But it is recognizing that in that moment, something of such consequence is on the line. And for the first time, you can command exactly the response that allows you, and here I am fully Heideggerian, to be. In that moment I was. I can say, ich bin, du bist. I am. And I am because I can command language in a way that you wish to disparage and attack and make me vulnerable. You cannot meet me on the terms of thinking. It is an accomplishment. Martin Heidegger saved my life. Thank God for Martin Heidegger. So.
I'm a bit confused about your command of language. At the instant when you're thinking, and you begin your thinking about thinking. Because what has clearly come across is your own being startled by the precision of what you said. So you also mentioned that attributions were important, or at the center of this. And so it would help me to understand the relationship between attribution and thinking. You know, is attribution an obstacle to? Is it a hindrance? Is it useful?
That's an almost moral question, almost an ethical question, because you're asking me, why does it matter so much that I struggle with attribution? And in some ways you're responsible for that, Professor Hassan, Professor, my colleagues over there, Professors Gravogi and Taiwo. In some ways that's that attribution, whether we like it or not, given our institutional location, is expected of us. And so, at a certain level, that is what I'm struggling with. I'm struggling with in public and yet not saying a word about it. In the pamphlet I say, I teach at this place where Du Bois is central. I teach at this place where Morrison got a degree. So I'm very aware of I'm tethering myself for a moment from that and saying I could not find the answers where I thought I would find the answers, and being in part shocked by that. Being, and I would say at another level, shocked by my own response, because I've got nothing against expletives, nothing against them. And I would have been fully justified in that moment to say, come on, right? I don't. Which is, again, your question and yours, right? It's that attribution is about where does this thing come from? Where does the sentence fully form and begins just so, right? It's got a just so quality. But attribution haunts, because attribution is what makes the question of race, lineage, intellectual trajectory, intellectual inheritance, the legacy to which one is responsible, a matter of profound difficulty. That's what much of this pamphlet is about working out. Why not Fanon? Why not Morrison? Why? Everybody has made a case for that. And yet in that moment it's not enough. Of course one can ask the absolutely existential question and say, what kind of black man am I? Not an Well, I'm the only one here who grew up under a system of legalized segregation and lesser thanness, so I win. But that's not the game we're playing. Attribution is a problem. Dedication to Heidegger is a problem. And that's as it should be. Because I tried to offer this in what I read, the extract I read, but not thanking these people, not turning to them, but being forced to turn to them. So, in some ways, that satisfies the dialectical, right? you have to account for what it is you do not do. And in that is a moment when, for me, there's nothing less than soul searching. Like how is it that I came to utter the sentence? But also then fully aware of 310 Triphammer Road. Yes. And what that encapsulates, what that means after I work at a place where another tradition is venerated. And I'm saying this tradition is valuable, but it doesn't allow me to do what I need to do in that moment. But here's the thing of it, that other tradition is never very far away. It's in fact profoundly intimate, and it's what unsettles this pamphlet. It's what asks for accounting, and that accounting can never be sufficient. That accounting can only continue to unhinge and cause difficulty and be the cause of further thinking. That's a difficulty with which one lives. But it's also a call for saying that thinking will not tolerate any form of prophylaxis. One has to read everything. And what happens in that tumult, that one can never account for. And perhaps the truth is that I revel in the tumult. Right? Out of that something comes. Thank God for Martin Heidegger. Right? But Martin Heidegger can never stand removed from these other things. There's only, and here's the most unsettling thing of all, there's only one figure of blackness in Martin Heidegger's entire earth. Just one. A Senegalese guy who for some reason wanders into, in Heidegger's imagination, wanders into a German classroom. That's it. So what am I? The Senegalese guy number 2? That's the other question. In this earth that has no place for me, I offer thanks. Which makes me wonder, what other black figures live in Martin Heidegger? What other unthought black figures of blackness might have just for a moment taken up residence there? So attribution, dedication, absence, living in the tumult that is thinking. Sorry.
I knew this was going to be intimate. Thank you so much. For questions, engagement, there are some refreshments back there. Please enjoy.